Well, good morning or good evening, everyone, and welcome at this new Trans-Pacific lecture event. Today, I am honored to present to you, to welcome Professor Michael CARSON. Michael CARSON is Associate Professor of Archaeology at the Micronesian Area Research Center of the University of Guam. His main interest is archaeology and ancient landscapes of the Asia-Pacific region. And his most popular books have included Archaeology of Pacific Oceania, Inhabiting a Sea of Islands, and Palaeolandscapes in Archaeology, Lessons for the Past and Future. The title of today's talk is Archaeology in a Sea of Islands, Ancient Landscapes and Seascapes of Pacific Oceania. Professor CARSON, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you for the very kind and friendly introduction. I'm honored to be part of the Crossroads Research Center Trans-Pacific Lecture Series, and thanks to Wim and Mathieu for organizing and making this possible. And thank you to everyone attending. We have people from all around the world, I believe. So good morning, good evening. Before we start, I would like to ask everyone just to think about where you are in the world, because we are in so many different places, and consider what happened in this place in the past. What was life like for the people who lived here? How did things change through time into the landscapes that we inhabit today? That topic will be what I will share with you. And in just a moment, I will start sharing my screen here. And I believe you should see that now. As was mentioned, today's topic is about archaeology in the Sea of Islands, ancient landscapes, and seascapes of Pacific Oceania. I would like to talk about how people came to inhabit this place that we call Pacific Oceania. The general map is shown right now on your screen. Typically today, we think of this region in terms of a few components. Now, one is Southeast Asia, another is Micronesia, and then two others are Melanesia and Polynesia. And these are historical or modern names that we have assigned to these areas. The people who live there indigenously never use those terms for themselves. They use other terms like the Tao or the Tau Tau or the Maori or the Maohi, meaning the people, usually of the land of where they live. And today, most of these people in Pacific Oceania are people who share very ancient traditions together, their distant ancestry of a Austronesian-speaking language family. Their languages are different, their traditions are different, their histories are different from each other, but they do share some core elements very deep in their past that they can recognize. And as one of the aspects that ties the history and the culture together in this vast world of the Austronesian-speaking world and generally in the Asia-Pacific region. But like I said, that the names of these places we attach today, and some of them are very obvious, like Mariana Islands or New Caledonia or the Cook Islands. Those are not the indigenous names of these places. However, people use these names just like they use names like Micronesia, Melanesia, and Polynesia to be convenient, talking about the world where we live. And this world where we live today, most people in the Pacific call it our Sea of Islands. This goes back to something from the 1990s that was proposed as the Sea of Islands. Instead of a vast ocean with dots of land, people envisioned the place as the inhabited seascape and landscape of Pacific Oceania, meaning that people don't see themselves as isolated, but rather as connected with the ocean and with each other across this large place. My work as an archaeologist has been looking at how people came to inhabit this place. It did not happen all at once, so how did it happen? The first clue is from geology about how the large land masses in Asia, through Southeast Asia, and as far as Australia and New Guinea, at one time, very long time ago during the last ice age, when sea level was much lower than today, were connected with large continental shelves and coastal masses and short water crossings between those land masses. So it's not completely land, but with some water where people could make short water crossings, and living throughout this area, all the way out through the supercontinent of Sahul, which is Australia and New Guinea and the Solomon Islands connected together, as early as at least 50,000 years ago. That time frame may be a little difficult for us to imagine today. So long ago, it was very different than the world that we inhabit today. The time overlapped with other ancient human ancestors or relatives, you might say, such as what are called the Denisovans, or you may have heard of the Hobbit found in Indonesia. These are known from very few fossils and some DNA evidence that could be interpreted as different species from Homo sapiens, or they could be interpreted as subvarieties of Homo sapiens, similar to how people envision the Neanderthals. That some people say that they're a different species, but most science actually says lately that they are a subvariety of Homo sapiens. So regardless of how you look at it, that is the context, that people living here very, very long ago, since the very beginnings of people, migrating across the globe as Homo sapiens living in here. And the focus in the Pacific Islands, or what we would call remote Oceania, the remote distance islands, was much more recent. Like the earliest dating is around 1500 BC, or a little bit older than that. You can notice that time difference between 50,000 all the way up through 1500 BC is a very large gap. So for a very long time, nobody lived in that remote oceanic world. The remote oceanic world, I should clarify, is the place beyond the sight of lands. People would need to be at sea beyond the distance of those short water crossings, and rather be at sea outside the sight of land for at least part of the journey before seeing land again. So it's like at least 350 kilometers, probably longer, to reach most of those islands in remote Oceania. So that inhabiting of Pacific Oceania, we say, is after 1500 BC. That does not whatsoever mean that every island was inhabited at 1500 BC. Some of them were inhabited much, much later than that. So how did that happen? So the next clue comes from historical linguistic studies. You probably have heard of the Austronesian language family, like I mentioned earlier. You probably know that according to the comparisons of the different languages in the Austronesian language family, that the oldest retention of specific grammar and features is in Taiwan, or the Formosan languages of Austronesia. They probably came from an older ancestry somewhere in mainland China. However, those speakers no longer existed by the time linguists were studying these issues, so we can't, by language alone, say that's their origin. So the origin, as far as we can trace in language, goes to Taiwan. And the next major branching is what's called the first branching of Malayo-Polynesian. So that's outside Taiwan and in most of island Southeast Asia, as well as into a little bit of remote Oceania, specifically Palau and the Mariana Islands, that not related to each other, but related to this older branching of Malayo-Polynesian. Another two language families are in Eastern Indonesia and West New Guinea that are difficult for the linguist to classify. So we don't know very well about their age and how they relate to others. That's why they're placed differently. It doesn't necessarily imply anything historical, but more about how they're difficult to classify. And then the rest of the Pacific is what we call oceanic. So it's this very big split at that time. And then that gets subdivided into nuclear Micronesian and Southern Melanesian, nuclear Polynesian, West Polynesian, East Polynesian, etc. For the purposes of this presentation, I will keep it simple, talking about these basic branchings. But what's so important is that almost all of the Pacific is this oceanic language branching. So that lines up with most of that split from 50,000 years ago, people living in the Western region versus much more recently everywhere else. However, that first branching of Malayo-Polynesian did extend into that western margin. So that brings our attention to that western margin, Palau and especially the Mariana Islands, as a place where maybe that is where we could find the oldest archaeological record as well. And speaking of the archaeological record, I will just briefly go through what we have concluded based on excavating and finding artifacts that are related to each other through time. So the first people making pottery and living in a sedentary lifestyle in Taiwan was about 2,800 BC, probably a little older than that actually, but for sure by that time. And then the next is moving across that transition from Formosan language of Austronesian into the Malayo-Polynesian speaking world. And that was hundreds of years later, moving into the northern Philippines. And the next step was around 1500 BC. And what you'll notice there is not only that we see an expansion of people moving into more parts of island Southeast Asia, like into Sulawesi and other parts of Indonesia, but also into remote Oceania, specifically the Mariana Islands, where, as I showed you just a moment ago, people indigenously speak the Chamorro language, which is a branching of the Malayo-Polynesian, but not in Palau yet at that time. The next is moving into the Bismarck Archipelago, famous for Lapita pottery. I will be discussing more of these details in a moment. Right now, I'm just giving you the overview. And the next branching was Lapita expanding into another part of remote Oceania, about Southern Melanesia and West Polynesia, as well as people living now by this time in Palau and some plainware pottery in the coast of New Guinea and the highlands of New Guinea as well. The next major branching that people often forget is moving into the bulk of Micronesia during like the 2nd century AD. Without that movement, people for a long time have presented this idea that nobody moved anywhere until moving into East Polynesia, which was actually much later, like around the year 1000. So you would have had this nearly 2,000-year gap between people living in West Polynesia and East Polynesia. But if Micronesia is part of the Pacific, which of course it is, then that narrative is not accurate. Rather, people continuously expanded living in the Pacific. And the final part we can say is moving southward into the colder climate zone of Aotearoa or New Zealand just a few hundred years later. Next, I will start giving you more details. I know that's a little slow starting with some of numbers on a map, so we will get into this next. I just want to remind you about the language grouping and how that language history is fairly consistent with the archaeological record as well. So that tells us we're on the right track of understanding how people came to inhabit this place. My work is more about not only the dating of when these steps happened, but also what the environment was like during those different times. One of the key aspects of understanding the natural history, at least, is the change in sea level. the change in sea level during these last few thousand years was not nearly, as of the magnitude that we had seen from the change of the last ice age of more than 100 meters of sea level change. Rather, it's just like less than 2 meters of sea level change. In Pacific Islands communities and landscapes, however, that small change in sea level is dramatic for not only for the shapes of the coastal landforms and the coastal ecology, but also for the people who live in those places and rely on those coastal niches for their livelihoods and their cultural traditions. We can identify a few key points in that sea level history that correspond with times when people expanded, moving across the Pacific, inhabiting different places. So the seascape and landscape that people found when they first moved into somewhere like, say, the Mariana Islands at 1500 BC was very different from when people moved into a place in East Polynesia like Hawaii after the year AD 1000. You can see it's actually a dramatic difference in sea level, as well as everything that goes along with it in terms of the coastal ecology, how people could gather different kinds of shellfish and other attributes of ancient life. Understanding that, let's go look at what was happening in Taiwan around the time of that first pottery layer that we associate with the first Austronesian speaking groups living in Taiwan. So this is around 2800 BC or earlier, when sea level was a little bit higher than today. Also, I should clarify, Taiwan has a very complex geological history that is different on the west versus the east coast. And also how, just as a reminder, that this is a different branching of the Austronesian language family before those branchings ever happened, in fact. So Taiwan, what did it look like? Was something like that at 2800 through 2200 BC. So when people first moved to the island, did not have those large coastal plains around it. And later, the coastline expanding a little bit more, the eastern mountain range rising up somewhat as well due to tectonic uplift of the coastal mountains, and that process continuing until the present conditions that we see today. So if we're looking for those ancient sites, we need to keep in mind what it looked like. Now, Dr. Hong Xiaotun, I believe, is with us in today's online meeting, and she was part of this project. Actually, I was just along helping in this project in Eastern Taiwan, looking for what the landscape was like at the time when people first were living in these places. And one of the known sites was around this area that you see here. And looking at it, in my perspective as a geoarchaeologist, this is a classic setting of multiple coastal ridges that had been there as sea level was changing through time, and sedimentation forming over those beach ridges. And there's Dr. Hong herself pointing at where we found a road had been cut through this area, and exactly where we would expect, according to the elevations of the island and of the sea level, was the classic pottery of that time period known as the TPK pottery or Dabengang pottery. Here's an example of what it looks like, just the fragments and the the professional illustration of it. And Dr. Holm continued with a large excavation to uncover exactly where this site was and how people lived there. And indeed, according to our calculations of the elevations and the changing landscape, the bottom part of the screen is when people first lived there on a beach ridge that was actually very close to the seashore at that time, as opposed to what you see in the top part of the screen, that is the modern condition, which is very far inland among the agricultural fields today. So this tells us a way of looking at the landscape in the ancient original context in its own terms, rather than looking at what we see on the surface today. Instead, looking at what it was like at that time. And that gives us a much better understanding that the people who first lived here were oriented toward the ocean much more than you would think looking at the surface today. Let's go a little bit forward in time, closer to 2200 BC, again on the eastern coast, but a little bit more south in the mountain range. Again, working with Dr. Hong Xiaochun. This was some of our joint work published in Current Anthropology in 2018. The left-hand side shows what the landscape was like when people first lived there. So today, these places look like hilltops, but in fact, those hilltops were very close to sea level at the time when they first were inhabited prior to 2000 BC, like 4,000 years ago. And because of the geological uplift, a very rapid geological uplift, and a change in sea level combined together, currently you see what is on the right-hand side of the screen, the modern condition of being raised up. And several of these sites all around the same elevation in places that today are hilltops, but originally were not. They were much closer to the sea level at that time. This is a view from one of those hilltops. It's known as the Fushan archaeological culture, which is a red-slipped pottery. You see some examples there. Why this one is so important for us is because this time period, like around 2200 BC or so, is the connection with Austronesians moving across the ocean to island Southeast Asia for the first time. And even more exciting is how it was the same kind of red-slipped pottery and the same kinds of shapes of the vessels at that time between Taiwan and the northern Philippines, showing that shared connection, as well as pieces of nephrite or jade and slate, which must have come from Taiwan geologically. And again, this is during a time of this earlier sea level. And again, the two of us, Dr. Hong and myself, worked in the northern Philippines to do the same approach again, trying to understand what it was like for people living there at that time. The left-hand side of your screen again shows the conditions at that time, like around 2200 BC and continuing through about 1500 BC, which is a large flooded valley floor with some marshland around it. The right-hand side of your screen shows what is there today. Excuse me. And so what we learned is that people at that ancient time were living probably in stilt-raised houses right over the water or marshlands at the edge of the water, and relying on certain kinds of freshwater shellfish. Also some deer and pig. There's possibly the oldest domesticated pig found at one of those excavations as well. So again, we're seeing this pattern of people preferring to live, excuse me, preferring to live very close with the seashore environment, or this watery environment, when they first moved to live in places, but things changed later in time. And this slide is just to show you again from Dr. Hong's work about the connection of the pottery, the bark cloth beaters, and other aspects of the material culture that show a very convincing connection at this very ancient time. So this is like 2200 through 2000 BC, this connection. But something happened a little bit later at 1500 BC. But by this time, people in the Philippines, the northern through central Philippines anyway, were making a very peculiar type of pottery that you see here. There's just a couple examples, which is a red-slipped pottery with finely dentate stamped decoration. What you see here is the examples of dentate stamping, like a comb impressed into the pottery. Also some circle stamps, and sometimes highlighted with a white lime infill. So it's a very distinctive type of pottery design, which we also find in the Mariana Islands at the same time, at 1500 BC. So here you see at the same time on the screen, the top part is from the northern Philippines, the bottom part is from the Mariana Islands, so showing the same technique and as well as some of the same artistic expressions of this early pottery that does not happen by accident. That combination of attributes is so peculiar and specific that we can see the connection of the cultural heritage between these two places at this particular time, at 1500 BC, between the northern through central Philippines and the Mariana Islands. We don't see this exact form of pottery farther southwards at this early time, but we do see plain red slipped pottery moving farther southward into Indonesia. And so that brings me to the next step in our story, or the next chapter, which is in the Mariana Islands, which is the first time when people were living in what we call remote Oceania, so beyond beyond the sight of land to reach there, which means, you know, the minimum voyaging distance for remote Oceania was 350 kilometers. In this case, coming from the Philippines or from anywhere would have been at least 2,000 kilometers, which is really remarkable. And I should stress was the longest ocean crossing voyage of that time in human history. No one else had ever done something like that across the ocean, but here they did it, moving into the Marianas. And again, I'll remind you, this was at a time when the sea level was higher than today, about 1.8 meters as measured in the Mariana Islands. So people are finding these kinds of seashores and coastal niches similar to what I showed you earlier. There's other examples in Taiwan and the northern Philippines, but in a smaller scale in the island world of the Marianas. And those coastal environments no longer existed, you know, some centuries later. And today they're unrecognizable. Here's a view from one of my favorite places in Guam, the Guam National Wildlife Refuge at the north end of Guam, looking across the channel to the island of Rota. And this broad coastal plain below, like you see here. This is a reverse angle. My work here showed a very ancient seashore habitation there, shown in the red circle, and two ritual caves there, and another two like camping shelter caves over there that all were inhabited around 1500 BC. And the shoreline was right there, like people were living right on the shoreline at that time. You cannot see these sites today. They are buried, you know, deeply beneath the ground, like you see here. I'm standing, my feet are standing on the ancient coral reef where people had placed the house over the coral reef. So it was in the tidal zone on stilts above the water and dumping down pieces of burned coral, fish bone, bird bone, shellfish remains, broken pottery and shell beads and other things into this watery environment. Don't want to go into too much detail, but the stratigraphy allowed me to be very constrained about dating the cultural layer itself versus what was below it and above it, to getting a constraint on the age and dating multiple things like different kinds of shells and corals and even pieces of algae, as well as dating not just by radiocarbon, but also by uranium thorium dating of the corals. And I mentioned some of the caves. I won't go into too much detail, but there are two ritual caves. There's one of them that actually contained a freshwater pool inside it at that time. Another cave here. This is one of the temporary cave shelters. What you can maybe see on the surface here is how the ground slopes downward a little bit toward the front, where I'm standing with the camera. You can see the relict of the ancient shoreline there. And another very large cave, a ritual cave with full of rock art inside it. I should say, where we found the cultural deposits, like where people were not living, but rather engaged in different ritual activities, were all outside in these overhang areas of the cave, not in the dark interiors. The dark interiors were reserved for rock art, like what you see here. And these handprints are very important, as well as for the freshwater pools that were there at that time when the sea level was higher. The primary food was these Anodara clam shells that no longer existed a few hundreds of years later, because after the sea level changed, then they no longer could survive in this culture, in that habitat. The caves, however, did not have that kind of shell. They had other kinds of foods that people were eating, probably associated with the use of those caves as special places that are not regular habitations, but rather specialized activities of giving offerings. The lower right-hand side of your screen shows some of the large shells, like a conch shell and a pearl shell, that were placed over these small pits, like they sealed at the top of the pits, and inside the pit were things like decorated pottery or very fine shell beads, like hundreds of beads in some cases. The pottery in these ritual contexts is very finely made, and is, again, that dentate stamped pottery with the circle stamps and white lime infill. This is the most dense concentration we ever found, as well as some like very unusual or unique items, like a dolphin tooth pendant, just the only one in the region, a saprea or cowrie shell that was made into a very small coconut crater, but it's like ornate, and all kinds of different shell circlets, armlets, beads, and other things that are just very finely made. And saprea shell beads that we don't see anywhere else in the Pacific, and we find only in this earliest time period. One of them, if you look closely, still retains a little bit of red pigment on it. We're not sure exactly what that was, but probably relates to whatever fiber or other material was through the bead. Now, reconstructing what the place looked like at that ancient time, when the sea level was higher, the freshwater lens, or the aquifer of the island, floated above it and was accessible inside these caves. The northern limestone plateau of Guam does not have any rivers or lakes or anything in it. The water just drains through the limestone. So this freshwater access was extremely important for people at that time. A little bit later, when sea level started to fall down, or to draw down, the caves no longer retained access to the fresh water. Rather, the fresh water came out in seeps just above sea level, like more than 100 meters away from here. And then the modern conditions is, a few hundred meters away out at the modern day seashore, which is actually an entirely different coral reef and lagoon than had existed in the past. So I would like to stress that point, that like everything about this context had changed, not only the sea level, but also that coastal ecology, with the different reef and lagoon and the different habitat and the kinds of shellfish and fish and other wildlife that could live in the place was completely different, as well as the cultural landscape and setting of how people could live in this area and how they interacted with this area. It was very different through time. But that's not the only site. I won't show you every single site that we investigated, but here is in the site of Point in Saipan of the Mariana Islands. This is a little bit farther north, which is a very deep excavation. I like this one. You can see the human scale, some of our friends excavating, helping out. And you can see very clearly the different layers in time, going back in time. And just to show like a simulation of what the landscape was like, this is the modern setting and the different layers, and each layer is dated differently. So when people first lived there, it was this very similar situation of a house raised on stilts directly at the ancient shoreline. And through time, the sea level changing and more sedimentation rising up, so creating an elevated coastal plain landform through time until you reach the modern setting today. So we have a separation of layers in a very different context. But the consistent thing we find in all of these cases is that people first lived very close with the shoreline, and then through time, things change into what we see today. And each one of those layers contains different pottery forms and styles, as well as different types of artifacts. So we have not only a change in the natural history, but also a change in the cultural history through time. And most information we find is from the pottery, like you see here. Again, I should emphasize dentate stamped and circle stamped on a red slipped pottery with the white lime infilling. Those are the main characteristics. So we know that this must come from that ancestry in the northern through central Philippines around that time, around 1500 BC. The next time we see anything like that is a couple hundred years later in the Bismarck Archipelago, just to the east of New Guinea. And this is the beginning of what we know and love as the Lapita pottery tradition. So it's slightly later. What made it different was using these elaborate decorations and motifs like you see on the screen here, just a few examples. But it's the same technique of dentate stamped pottery, but applied in a very different way. So there is a relation ancestrally that is shared among all these groups, but in the Lapita world becoming much more elaborate. And this was, again, at a time when the sea level still was, a little bit higher than today. It had not yet begun the drawdown in the Bismarck Archipelago. My colleague Glenn Summerhays shared these pictures that I'm showing you now from his excavations in the Bismarck Archipelago. And what you can see is the use of circle stamping and dentate stamping, and the white lime infilling is more prevalent in these earliest parts of Lapita. You don't see it much later, actually, but this is a rare example. And on the screen now is an example of the famous Lapita face pottery found by Roger Green in the Solomon Islands. So not in the Bismarck Archipelago, but in the Solomon Islands, and probably around 1200 BC. We're not exactly sure of that dating. The next major thing that happened in our cultural history was a move from that core homeland of Lapita out into remote Oceania again, specifically into South Melanesia and West Polynesia, the islands such as in New Caledonia, Vanuatu, Fiji, Tonga, Samoa, Tuvalu, Tokelau, Wallis, and Futuna Islands, pretty much all at once between 1100 BC and 800 BC. So just a few hundred years time window of people bringing that Lapita pottery from its older origins in the Bismarck Archipelago out into this part of the remote oceanic world. I'm showing you on the screen as well the sea level change. So this was at a time when the sea level already had started to draw down slightly. So people in this context were moving to these islands, again, looking for these kinds of coastal shoreline niches that the same as what I showed you earlier in the Mariana Islands, but in a context when the sea level was in the process of drawing down and changing. So they're moving into this place and adapting to new conditions at the same time. But Lapita was not the only thing in the Pacific at that time. People were living in Palau for the first time, and also with a plain pottery. It is not dentate stamped, it's not red slipped, it's just a plain pottery. Similar plain pottery is on the south coast of New Guinea and in some of the highlands. And some of the south coast of New Guinea, the sites do have dentate stamped pottery, which appears to be like toward the very end of the Lapita period, like around 800 BC or maybe even a little bit later. Lapita pottery just abruptly ended around 500 BC. So like when people were adapting to live in these conditions and the sea level was drawing down, that no longer was a viable way of living, by 500 BC. So people lived in other places, made different kinds of pottery, engaged with their environment in a different way by 500 BC. I want to show you here is one of my excavation projects in New Caledonia. This is the Vabuto area in the northern province on the west coast, looking out. And when I looked at this place, to me, it was very obvious that most of that lowland would have been underwater at the time when people first lived here. If I wanted to look for Lapita sites, then I would look in places like those two dots around the coast. And in fact, I did find Lapita pottery in both of those places, and reconstructed something like what you see here. So it was not connected to the mainland, but rather a separate offshore islet at that time when when Lapita people were living here, just at those two places. Then the modern condition that we see today on the surface has many, many sites distributed all over the landscape. So those are two very different types of landscapes. So once again, that coordination of the natural history and the cultural history brings to life for us, what people were doing at that time. And I mentioned earlier how for many archaeologists, they have wondered about how people could live in this part of the Pacific nearly 3,000 years ago, but not move to Polynesia until 1,000 years ago. And the key to dissolving that misconception is Micronesia. So Micronesia is a place where like around AD 100 through 200, people lived throughout this region for the first time. And so you'll notice that the Mariana Islands, Palau, are considered Micronesia. However, that's a name that we impose on the region today. They are different linguistically and historically. But Micronesia, meaning like this area of small islands or atolls, was inhabited around this time. And part of the key to understand this history is about the sea level change. You can see that dramatic drop in sea level leading up to like the 1st century AD. By that time, sea level had drawn down enough that these atolls, like you see here, were emerged enough above the salt water. Otherwise, before that time, yes, people probably knew that some land existed here, but it was not really inhabitable, specifically because the freshwater lens was not really available. So when the sea level dropped down enough to expose the land, the freshwater lens floated above it. And as you see here, and that gave enough land where people could live, and the fresh water allowed people to dig into the sandy, landform of these atolls to dig these pits that were for growing swamp taro, which is essential for living in these islands. So during the 1st centuries AD, this lifestyle became possible for the first time. And we see people living all across the islands. I should note that Micronesia, even today, is known for its sailing traditions. Is very strong. Like even during World War II, when battleships were in the Pacific, Micronesian people continued their traditional sailing traditions. One of the pictures you see there. And additionally, we see very quickly a hybridization of the breadfruit from west to east across the Pacific. The Mariana Islands and maybe Palau have their own version of breadfruit, which is actually called, the Artocarpus marianensis. So it's named after the Mariana Islands. So it's a breadfruit with seeds inside it, or a seeded breadfruit, as opposed to the unseeded breadfruit. So they have both, in fact. And then they became hybridized west to east across what we today call Micronesia. So these places that were inhabited after about AD 100 through 200, we know they must have been in contact west through east across this region because of the hybridization of the breadfruit after that time. And just to reiterate, during the Spanish and later contact times in Micronesia, specifically in the Mariana Islands, the indigenous Chamorro sailing canoe was called the proa, or the flying proa. It was considered almost magical, a flight that it could move across the water so quickly and change direction so quickly. These aspects probably are very important for how people could manage those long distance voyages at such an early date across the Pacific. And I want to stress that these traditions are alive and well today, sometimes using a mix of traditional and modern materials, and but people learning how to do it even today. So I think that's just wonderful. And the next thing that happened was people moving across the Pacific into East Polynesia, and then south into Aotearoa or New Zealand. So by the year, like after the year 1000, we have a fully inhabited Pacific, like we know today. People living everywhere with sailing canoe technology and navigation knowledge about all of the islands. So people not only are living everywhere, but also able to maintain contacts with each other. So the way I've shown you here is, but instead of drawing an arrow, I've shown you these growths of the inhabited landscape and seascape, implying not just people moving from one point to another point, but rather maintaining contact across these regions. So that's the world where people lived after about the year 1000. It was this interconnected world of what today we call a sea of islands. And this time period is associated with like the modern, sea level that we have today, or very close to it, not too much change. So you could look at the surface today and see the kind of environment, or very close to the kind of environment where people first were living in East Polynesia, at least. That is the time when we see things like this. The Moai of Easter Island is all after that time, as well as other sites, which I'll show you in a moment. Wait, but first let me go back to this. This time period is a time when every island group all across Pacific Oceania made things like what you see here, things like the Moai. So stonework, terraces and platforms for their houses, or stone pillars supporting their houses, as well as stone monuments, such as the Moai, all after the year 1000. The other thing that happened was people being buried at their houses or in front of their houses. So a tie or a connection between the people and their land or their territory. All of that is after the year 1000. But the Moai, like you see here, are not, an isolated, anomaly. They're part of this larger Polynesian tradition that I will show you here in the Marquesas Islands in French Polynesia. This is my work back in the 1990s in this valley far back here in Tahuata. This is my crew working with me clearing these stonework platforms. So there's Teiki and Teaiki and Christian, Joseph, Ani, Manohi, and Pena, all sitting there. These are my friends for a few years working in this valley, and they are the local farmers who taught me about the land and what they do in the land. And they know these sites, but never had really cleared off the vegetation until we got there. So this is some close-up look at the stonework and a view of what these platforms look like when they're cleared. And one area in particular, these stone, what we would call tiki or tiki heads. So the Moai are related, in Easter Island, are related to this tradition of the marae and the tiki, which is just a representation of ancestors. Each one of these 4 stone heads is life-sized and individual, like individual characteristics and personality, like the traditional woman's tattoo around the mouth and the face. Another one has a scar. Another one has like a grimace. So they're all individual people or ancestors. And that's the kind of tradition that you see throughout Eastern Polynesia. Not necessarily in this way, in stone heads, but sometimes in wooden sculpture or statues, or the large stone statues of the Moai in Easter Island or Rapa Nui. Also in the Marquesas Islands, people, this is my friend Ani, who wanted to show me about pounding breadfruit. Pounding breadfruit is something you see throughout Polynesia and some parts of Micronesia, always done with this wooden board and a stone pounder that's usually about this shape that you see here, and pounding breadfruit, which is known as poi. And this action of making the poi and learning about it is something considered just part of what everybody needs to learn how to do growing up, and it's just part of knowing about the culture and the history. So throughout the region, poi, breadfruit, is like a very important cultural identifier. However, poi, if you go to Hawaii, like you see here, poi is known as taro. paste. We do have some traditions in Kauai, like you see here. This is the North Shore of Kauai in Honolulu. Some oral traditions of the Mu or the Mo'aimaya, the banana-eating Mu people who lived here before the taro farmers. So it could be some remembrance or commemoration of a time before people were making poi as taro. Honolulu and other places are known for their intensive, like irrigated fields for taro, and nowadays used for other things as well, but primarily were for taro. So these intensive, high density agricultural fields, or I would say horticultural fields, as well as fish ponds, artificial fish pond. This is one of the examples again in Kauai. So, so something happened in Hawaii that did not happen in other places, which was like a very rapid population growth and people intensifying their use of the land, not only for growing taro, but also for growing the fish in their fish ponds, and growing and creating these massive stonework monuments like you see here. This is Kamehameha's like rise to power was at this place at Pukohola. And I excavated there as well. Here is showing the scene as it was in the early 1800s when people visited here, versus the modern scene today. When I excavated, I found much older deposits that predated Kamehameha's time. And again, well, let me go back a little bit. Kamehameha, if you don't know, is like during the late 1700s was like the first like paramount chief of all of the islands of Hawaii, who conquered, like by conquests. It was violent, against like his own relatives, conquering different parts, not only of Hawaii Island, but also Maui and the other islands. The only place that resisted was Kauai, which was known as the Separate Kingdom. And Kauai, their chief, Kubuali'i, just said, "Don't invade, we won't fight, I will just pledge my allegiance." So there wasn't any direct warfare. And according to some traditions, that they had a separate agreement, but we won't get into that today. What I do want to say is that Kamehameha did things that set him apart from like normal human conduct. Like he would, one of his high-ranking advisors lived at this place and would capture people on the road at night and throw their bodies to sharks to be eaten, which is like something you're not allowed to do, but in his case it was allowed. Or things like killing his cousin and sacrificing him at the temple here, and things that set him apart from ordinary human conduct. And so many of those traditions are remembered actually quite fondly in Hawaii Island, but not anywhere else. So we have multiple ways of looking at this history. And I mentioned that we find these stonework monuments everywhere at the same time. Here is some vintage pictures of one of the first times when Nanmadol was cleared off of vegetation. Nanmadol is a stonework city in Pohnpei in eastern Micronesia. It is sometimes called the Venice of the Pacific because it has canals running through it in the mangroves. And it's really large and complex. This is just like a schematic plan view of the different parts of the Nanmadol complex. So again, this is probably around, the oldest is around 1300 AD. So it's very late in the sequence, yet today is understood as one of the most important sites in the Pacific. Similarly, the large stone money discs, the rai of Yap, were from this later time period, all after the year 1000, actually significantly later. So people from Yap would go across the ocean in their canoes to Palau, where they would find places to quarry the stone money discs and bring them back to Yap. And they are like investments of what are called stone money discs, showing wealth and power of the people who have them. in Palau, if you go there today, then you can see these examples of the traditional houses that all date back to this older time of about the year 1000 is the oldest of them. So this is a men's house, and the men's house and the women's houses are separate things. And there are many stonework constructions all around, like pavings where people could walk or not walk, and border fences or walls around these places, and excuse me, piles of stone that are for burials and other ritual areas. So all after the year 1000. So each place I've shown you has its own expression of this stonework monument tradition. The same is true in the Mariana Islands. This picture is from, like I think the 1800s, is sort of a romanticized fantasy version of what the Lati sites look like. Here is a more accurate version. Here is the largest that ever stood, the House of Taga in Tinian Island. And so these are stone pillars with these like hemisphere stones atop them. And then the wooden house would have been over that, raised up above the ground. And I want to stress this time period, at least in the Western Pacific, excuse me, this time period coincided with some of the earliest historical written records in the Pacific. Like Magellan was in Guam in the Marianas in the year 1521. So that's about as early as we can get with historical documents. The left-hand view is a map from those records, which is not really accurate cartographically, but it's just a representation. On the right-hand side is some decades later, a visualization of what a Spanish galleon scene would have looked like around in Guam. And again, I want to emphasize that the indigenous Chamorro people of Guam and the Marianas were in these canoes that the the Spanish and other Europeans called the proa, or the flying proa, that could move very quickly around their boats. And people were astounded at the speed the boats could move and their ability to change direction so quickly. Other historical documents date like to 1602 with Juan Pobre living in Rota for quite some time, and then the later Jesuit chronicles, which is like the later 1600s, and and leading into the Spanish Chamorro Wars in Guam and the Mariana Islands. And that pretty much was complete by the year 1700, when the surviving people were relocated into a few villages. So we have this overlap of several hundreds of years of written records and cultural practice and language traditions that overlap with the traditional archaeological records. It's a very rich time period, at least in the Western Pacific. And bringing that knowledge together helps us to understand this later period in the archaeological context. Actually, most of what we know about what we call the Lati period in the Marianas comes from those historical records and unwritten histories and being applied backwards in time to the Lati. And so what do we do today? I want to leave you with some examples, like practical things that we do today. This is again at the Guam National Wildlife Refuge. Earlier I showed you that the landscape changing through time, and I mentioned that you cannot see these sites today. They're deeply buried under the ground. So what do you do when people want to visit and learn about the place? Well, I've been working with the National Wildlife Refuge and the staff for several years, and together we cut hiking trails. This is one of those trails, and the staff took my information from archaeology and made these various signposts. Here's one of them. They just took my model and they inserted their own words on it, saying, "No, you are here," right? So this is what the place looked like at 1500 BC when people first were living here, and then here's what it's like now. So that in recognition that you can't see any of the site on the surface, they figured this was a good way of orienting people with what the landscape looked like. You're just saying, you know, here it is, and then using these signs and prompts as a way to encourage people thinking about where they are, what the landscape look like, and building conversations with the people who go on these guided tours. The guided tours are like every weekend, and then we have special events once in a while. The special event shown here is with, at the time, was the Speaker of the House and the Vice Speaker and the different legislatures and politicians of Guam coming out to tour the site, which is really an unusual thing. I don't know many places in the world where the politicians come out in the hot sun, sweating, looking at archaeological sites, but we do it fairly often in Guam. The team comes out to whenever I excavate. This is just a very small 1 by 1 meter excavation you see on the left-hand side. So they learn about what I'm doing firsthand, and they can translate that information when they guide their tours or when children come to visit, you know, like you see in the other part of the screen here. The refuge additionally is a place where people not only come to visit the sites, but also do things like practice traditional sling stone throwing. That's what you see in the upper left-hand side, or to come and pray to the ancestors. That's just what you see in the lower right-hand side. So it's an active place of all different kinds of cultural traditions. Some of my students are shown here in the upper left. They're also part of, you know, Chamorro traditional practicing groups that perform chants or rituals, like for when a business opens or at a wedding or at a funeral. They often would come to my archaeological excavations to bless the excavation and talk with the ancestors. The bottom right is one of the refuge staff pointing very proudly to where he found a white pigment pictograph in one of these caves. So he's very proud of that. I wanted to share that with you. That's my friend Brian. And also the red handprints that are in one of these caves are like a very special place where people know that they can't touch these things, but they can raise their hand nearby and imagine, wow, that's like a hand similar to my hand, and maybe this is one of my ancestors who did that in the case. So it's a very powerful experience for people coming to experience these places, as well as, of course, students at the University of Guam, shown here, learning about archaeology and about the sites of their ancestors, but not only indigenous Chamorro people of Guam, but also indigenous people from Pohnpei, from Palau, from Yap, from Chuk, you know, from throughout Micronesia, who come to the University of Guam as the central place in the region. And so we have these wonderful conversations comparing and contrasting cultural traditions and histories among the groups. But not only in Guam do we do this, like throughout, you know, this is showing some of our experiences in Tinian and Saipan Island, working with the government archaeologists of the Historic Preservation Office and related government offices, learning like firsthand archaeological training that they might not have in other opportunities. And so they learn the technical training that helps them in their careers and their job placement, but furthermore, interpreting and talking with the public. So it's not just myself as an archaeologist talking with the community, but the community growing with more knowledge about archaeology. And similarly, in other parts of the Pacific, you know, traditions are alive and well. This is a group from northern province of New Caledonia. When they perform their dance that you see captured in just a moment here, they are conveying the story of their history of their ancestors. And in one of the Polynesian outliers shown here in the Uvea and the Loyalty Islands, you know, whenever people open the food, you know, cooked in an earth oven, then it's, you know, a reenactment or of a historical event for them. It's related to their tradition of when the Polynesians first moved to live in these Polynesian outliers. and many other places. Samoa, shown here, is probably most famous for historical cultural traditions that are highly ritualized. And why I'm showing you these things, these events and traditions are tied to not just the events that happen, but also to the history behind them. And by practicing these traditions of, displaying the woven mat, or presenting the roasted pig, to the chiefs, those acts sort of reaffirm the social order and the relations, and they call back to this long history of these traditions of how they happen. So all of these ways of engaging with cultural tradition are historical and ways of understanding the past that, as an archaeologist, I really appreciate, because I can look at these things and see, oh, well, this is how that stone tool or that pig bone ended up in the archaeological record, right? I have a larger interpretation. Equally important is the archaeologist like myself communicating and sharing what I've learned, so that people can add that knowledge to their tradition. I hope what I've showed you is that these areas of Southeast Asia, Micronesia, Melanesia, Polynesia are related to each other. They were not inhabited all at once. Obviously, we had that clue from the geology of the land masses separated from remote Oceania. We had the clues from language family, and then we can add this map from archaeology. I regard this kind of map as probably the most important contribution that archaeology can give to historical and cultural studies of the region, because it clarifies that people did not live everywhere all at once, but rather people incrementally moved across the Pacific, living in what I call, the inhabited landscape and seascape of Pacific Oceania. So little by little, each of those steps you see here represents a growth of the known inhabited world, and people being in contact with each other across that inhabited world. So they weren't, completely separated from each other. I don't think anybody ever would argue that, but rather just slowly, incrementally inhabiting a larger Pacific world. And I know that was a great amount of information, but that was the main points that I wanted to share. And I hope that was clear. And I'm very thankful for the opportunity to share this presentation with everybody. I hope that was informative and encouraging of some new ideas and discussions. So thank you very much.